Episode 104, Caught Red-Handed. George parked the car and he and Sophia got out. They walked through Thousand Tree Plaza and Sophia pointed to an intimate-looking restaurant.
"George, let's go in. I heard that the food there is really good."
Sophia's eyes darted around as she started to come up with a plan in her mind. To create a romantic atmosphere, the restaurant had candlelit tables. With the addition of some nice red wine, it would increase the ambiguous feeling between her and George and pull him toward her. "Is this where you were supposed to meet your blind date?" George asked as he checked out the restaurant.
"No, that was a coffee shop. But he suddenly texted to say that he had to work overtime, and I wasn't prepared to wait for him for an hour and a half. Since we're already here, we might as well go in and have a meal together. I bet you haven't eaten yet today, and I don't want you passing out on me because you're starved."
Sophia tried to make light of the situation, but she also didn't want to be talking about Melton all day. It was her day to be alone with George. She had been maintaining her image and making sure to leave a good impression on him. She couldn't let a good opportunity like this pass. Without really thinking about it, George followed Sophia inside. Not long after sitting down, they had ordered steak, pasta, and red wine. Then they looked at each other. With Sophia staring into his eyes, George felt a little uncomfortable. He didn't want to just stare back at her as if there was nothing else to look at, so he looked at his surroundings in the restaurant. He felt something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. After a minute or two, some music started playing and George looked over to see a man playing a saxophone for a couple at a nearby table. Sophia thought for a moment, and then stood up and walked over to the maitre d'. She whispered a few words in her ear and returned to her seat. "What were you saying to that woman just now?" George asked curiously. Sophia looked at him with an ambiguous smile.
"Don't be impatient. You'll find out in a while."
Hearing her words, he just became even more curious. After a while, their dishes were served and the saxophone player came over and stood in front of their table and started playing.
"Cheers, George,"
Sophia said with a smile as she raised her glass. "Yes, cheers." George also raised his glass, clinking it with Sophia's, and then took a sip. As she put her glass back down, Sophia asked,
"Do you like music?"
"Sax? Oh, I get it. When you just spoke to that person, did you request some music?" George felt enlightened and complimented. "Sophia, I didn't expect you to be so considerate."
"George, you don't need to call me Sophia. We've known each other for so long, it sounds a bit weird. Plus, I don't like you calling me that. You should have a special name for me."
Sophia fluttered her eyelids as she spoke. "Then what should I call you?" He was embarrassed for a moment. He couldn't think of anything else that he would call her. Soph didn't quite sound right to him.
"You can just call me Babe,"
Sophia suggested. George thought that would make them seem too close and intimate. "I don't know, that doesn't seem right." He looked at her in surprise. She was Mary's cousin, and even if she didn't like to talk about it, she was a few years older than him. She could have been his older sister.
"George, I hate you,"
she said jokingly, playfully hitting his arm.
"Can you call me Babe?"
She put her hand on his and slowly moved her body closer to him. An unknown factor could be seen in her beautiful almond eyes. That close to her, George could smell the unique fragrance coming from the smooth, white skin of her neck. He could feel the warmth of her soft body slowly closing in on him. Candlelight lit up her face with a red glow, giving her a coquettish beauty. George was so stunned that he forgot to breathe for a few seconds. A beautiful woman like Sophia, with her perfect figure, could easily confuse any man who got close enough to her. Half an hour after George and Sophia, Mary and Melton arrived at Thousand Tree Plaza. Mary wholeheartedly wanted to buy some dresses, bags, or anything else that took her fancy while she was there. But she also wanted to talk to Melton first, to make sure he was willing to pay for her. As she looked around, she saw a familiar face in the window of a restaurant.
What's Sophia doing here? She wondered. Didn't she say she had an emergency to take care of?
Then Mary opened her mouth in shock. The person sitting opposite Sophia was George.
It can't be! She must have changed her mind. Why didn't she tell me? Fortunately, I brought Melton with me, so it's worked out fine anyway. Melton, she said out loud, I think I just saw Sophia. Really? Where is she?
When he heard that Sophia was there, his mood instantly lifted. He looked around, trying to find her. Mary pointed to the restaurant and Melton walked toward it excitedly. He didn't say anything and just left her where she stood. When he walked in and saw that Sophia wasn't alone, it took him a moment to react. He shouted angrily,
Sophia, you! What are you doing here?
George and Sophia were both startled and hurriedly sat up straight. The shock also cleared George's head. Whoa, he thought. What am I doing? I almost just kissed her. The atmosphere in the restaurant must have been too romantic. It had affected the hormones in his body. It seemed that apart from Charlie, he couldn't take a woman to a restaurant without doing something stupid. Meanwhile, Sophia was furious.
Why does that bastard have to come in here and ruin the moment? And just as I was about to seal the deal, she screamed in her head. He needs to go away and leave me alone. Can't he see I'm with someone?
She seethed, as she had been about to succeed and make George her boyfriend. But then Melton had turned up out of nowhere. Melton hadn't expected to see Sophia there. Of course, as far as he knew, she was at work, dealing with some sort of emergency. Now, he just thought this was a setup, and that Mary had deliberately led him there to catch Sophia red-handed.
You all…
Melton was practically speechless. He had just seen the intimate scene between Sophia and George. He couldn't believe that the woman he had spent so much time with and paid so much attention to would suddenly be in a relationship with another man. He had always thought that she was determined to be with him, and that he could continue stringing her along for as long as he wanted to. Episode 105. Melton's Meltdown. George felt quite awkward. Given the suddenly tense atmosphere, he didn't know what to say. As for Sophia, she just stared at Melton coldly. She hadn't expected him to appear. Earlier that day, she had suggested to Mary that she would invite Melton to Thousand Tree Plaza to spend some time with her. However, when she later bumped into George, she changed her mind. When Mary had called her, she had said that the plan would have to wait for another day. But now it appeared that Mary had brought Melton to her anyway, completely failing in her task.
What are you doing here? She eventually asked, with a scathing tone to her voice.
She glared at Melton in anger. At that moment, she just wanted him to disappear, to be as far away from her as possible.
You're the one asking me that?
Melton's face turned red with a mixture of embarrassment and anger.
Didn't you say that you had some emergency at work? Why are you here? And with some random chump as well?
By now, Melton was getting anxious. He liked Sophia a lot. Unlike any of the other girls he had liked in the past, he was satisfied with Sophia in every aspect. Her face, her body, and even her position working in the bank. If the two of them were to succeed in the future, she was someone he would want to take out to meet people. The reason why he had been delaying asking her out officially was that he wanted to string her along for a while and make her almost desperate for him. But now it looked like someone else was getting involved because he hadn't made his move yet. Moreover, it was just some chump who was inferior in every aspect. Melton's words completely annoyed Sophia.
Screw you, she railed at him in her head. I was so close to getting George to kiss me, and you had to spoil it by rushing over here to disturb us. And now you dare to insult him as well?
She stood up and slapped Melton hard on the face.
Who the hell do you think you are? I can do what I want and with who I want. Get out of here and leave us alone."
Melton was shocked. Damn, what's going on? He wondered. Sophia had never been this way with him. The two of them had always been friendly when they talked, never even arguing. When she talked to him, she was usually flirtatious, not angry. Even when she smiled at him, it was always with affection. But the two of them had their ideas, both of them waiting for the other to take the initiative and make things clear. After all, whoever gave in first would lose this unspoken emotional game. But now, he had been slapped in the face by Sophia, just because he was unhappy that she was having a meal with some other guy. As George watched this all unfold in front of him, he felt even more uncomfortable. It had quickly gotten to the point where it was a physical conflict, and it was all because of him. He knew that Sophia was just using him to deal with this guy and stop him from harassing her. However, the atmosphere had quickly become very tense, and he didn't know what to do. He decided the best course of action was to do his best to play along with the plan they had originally agreed on. He stood up as well and said, "Excuse me, who are you?"
"Who am I? I'm her boyfriend, that's who. Who the hell are you to be getting close to my woman? Don't you think that I won't mess you up just because you were in public?"
Melton vented his anger onto George in one go. He sized up George's slight frame and took in his immature appearance. He thought to himself that George was just some little rascal who was barely even old enough to start shaving yet.
"Melton, I told you to leave us."
When Sophia heard Melton say that he was her boyfriend in front of George, she was so angry that she felt like she was about to explode. She quickly slapped Melton again and yelled,
"Go! You're mad. What nonsense are you talking about? What right do you have to call me your woman?"
With that, Sophia took George's hand and headed for the door, pulling him along after her.
"George, let's go. Don't bother with this lunatic." "Sophia, stop right there," Melton yelled. "Do you hear me? I forbid you to leave with this guy."
He was unwilling to give up, and he didn't care who heard him.
"Who do you think you are? Do you dare to speak to me like that? I'll leave with whoever I want to leave with. It's my choice to make. From now on, I don't want to see you again, or I'll call the police and tell them you're harassing me."
By now, Sophia was getting irate, and her patience with Melton had completely run out. She spat at him and turned back to the door again. Still pulling George along as she walked out, she looked across at him apologetically.
"George, I'm sorry. It was unlucky for us to bump into that madman here."
The two of them ignored Melton, who was still shouting after them, and walked out of the restaurant with their arms intimately intertwined. Melton stood rooted to the spot in the restaurant. He gnashed his teeth as he looked at their retreating backs and said fiercely, "Screw you, little girl. Just you wait." Sophia kept a tight hold on George's arm as they walked out of Thousand Tree Plaza. At that point, she was anxious, angry, and apprehensive, worried that he would misunderstand her. His expression was unclear, and her heart thumped like a war drum as she racked her brain for a way to explain it to him clearly. "Are you okay?" George was indifferent to Sophia's quandary, but when he saw her face, he was genuinely worried about her. Sophia's eyes lit up as she thought of a good idea.
"George,
Her eyes started to well up as she looked at him, with a pained expression, as if something terrible had happened to her. George was surprised to see her like that. He immediately asked, "Why are you crying all of a sudden? What happened?"
"George, you just saw what happened back there. That man is the one who's been pestering me all this time, saying that I'm his woman whenever we meet, that he's my boyfriend. I've already rejected him so many times, but he refuses to listen to me, and he's still trying his best to win my parents around, forcing me to be with him." but I don't like him. I don't want to give my life to someone I don't like." Sophia was speaking in such a miserable manner, and the tears continued to flow freely down her cheeks. George thought that what she said made sense, and why should she have to be with someone she didn't like? Such a life would indeed be sad. He couldn't help but feel sympathy for her after being infected by her emotions. He put his hand on her head and stroked her hair gently. "Sophia, please don't cry anymore. You should just be with the person you want to be with." Episode 106. Failed Seduction. As he spoke, George wiped the tears from Sophia's face. She threw herself into his arms and said, "You're such a good person, George. You're the one I want. I really like you." George stiffened in shock at her confession. As she pressed her soft body against his, he didn't know what to do. Seeing his daze, Sophia twisted against him, trying to arouse him to action. Then she stood on her tiptoes and pressed her tender red lips to George's mouth, parting his lips with her tongue. George felt as if a million bees were buzzing around in his mind. He was speechless and a little lost. Sophia grabbed his hands and placed one on her waist and the other on her hips, and then allowed her own hands to roam his body. She wasn't sure if her seduction would work. Maybe being so close to her would have no effect on him. But then she looked up and saw his confused expression. She lowered her head and smiled. George would soon be hers. Just then, Sophia's cell phone rang, shocking George back to awareness. He pushed her away, confused and angry at himself for what he had almost done. He wasn't that kind of person. How could he let himself be seduced by another woman when he already had strong feelings for Charlie? He should never have let Sophia get so close. Sorry, George stammered. I have to go. I just remembered I have something I need to do." Despite Sophia's protests, he turned and left without looking back. He wanted to go home and take a cold shower so he could calm down. Sophia stood in the square, watching George's back as he walked away. She had been so close, but she still had a lot to be proud of. It had only been their first date, but her relationship with George was progressing well. She answered her phone with a frown. "What do you want, Mary?" she asked. "Where are you now, Sophia? I'll come meet you. I admire your acting skills. You were so good that I almost believed you," Mary said into the phone. She had been hiding outside the restaurant earlier and had seen everything. Mary smiled as she continued. "You should have seen the look on Melton's face after you left. He was so shocked and obviously full of regret. Your plan worked, Sophia. I think he'll start pursuing you soon. Then you can kick that loser George to the curb." She laughed, genuinely happy for her cousin, but also excited for the benefits she would receive soon. Sophia laughed dryly. "Haha, I'm going home. You should too. You don't need to bother with this Melton business anymore." "All right, but didn't you say that you would reward me once your plan succeeded?" Mary asked, revealing her true intentions. "Oh, right," Sophia stalled, searching for a good reason to end the call. "We'll talk about that another time. I'm getting another call. It might be from Melton." She hung up, a cold expression on her face. So, Mary had the nerve to ask for compensation after almost ruining her plan to seduce George. She should slap her instead. Sophia dropped her phone into her bag and signaled for a taxi. By that time, George had already driven back to school. The first thing he did was rush into the shower, fully clothed, and turn on the cold water. After about half an hour, his mind finally began to clear. He found a towel, dried himself, and walked out of the bathroom. "George, what happened to you?" Matt asked, stunned. He had just returned to the dorm and was sitting at his desk. George smiled. "Nothing.
It's just really hot outside and I needed a cold shower." Matt nodded in acknowledgement and returned to his work. George changed his clothes, climbed into bed, and thought about how close he had been to breaking Charlie's trust. After that, he fell asleep. When he opened his eyes, it was morning. He called Charlie to ask if she wanted to go to the mall with him to buy the things she wasn't able to get the day before. But she said she had class that morning and work in the afternoon, so they would have to do it another time. George hung up the phone in disappointment, but then he thought of Gina. He still owed her a meal, so he called her. When she answered, he chuckled and said, "Gina, are you free right now? I'll treat you to a meal."
"George, I can't right now,"
she stuttered, sounding as though she was in a difficult situation. Thinking she must be busy, he said, "It doesn't matter if you don't have time today. We can do it tomorrow or the day after." She knew that he would keep insisting, but she was stuck at home with her father, so she could only say,
"It might be a while before I can go out. I can't eat with you."
"Why not?" George asked, feeling a bit uneasy. "No matter how busy you are, you still have to eat." Gina said awkwardly. She didn't know how to answer him. Episode 107. A Confusing Conversation. Hearing Gina's flattering voice made George feel that something was off, so he asked, "Did something happen?" Gina sighed.
"Fine, I'll tell you, but you have to promise not to laugh at me. My father locked me in my house."
George was stunned. He knew there must be a reason she couldn't go out, but he hadn't expected it to be because of Mr. Grant. "Are you joking? Why did he lock you up?" he asked, curious. When she didn't answer, he started making wild guesses. Gina knew that George wouldn't give up, so she explained.
"After the incident with the BMW, that weasel Terry tattled to his dad, who then called my dad. He was so angry that he grounded me. But you don't have to worry. It won't be for long. Then I can treat you to dinner instead."
George didn't respond. He didn't think that was the real reason she was locked up. Terry's father knew Gina's father. When Gina taught Terry a lesson, he couldn't retaliate because he was afraid of her family's influence. So he found an adult to handle his revenge for him. But it wasn't really Terry's fault that Gina was locked up. It was because of the trouble that George had caused her. After all, George had brought her to deal with Terry, and she had taken all the responsibility upon herself. He felt both touched and guilty at the same time. After that, George hurriedly ended the conversation and hung up. He felt that he needed to do something to make up for his negligence, so he dialed Flora's number. She answered after the first ring.
"Hello, Mr. Rudd. Is there something I can help you with?"
George was stunned for a moment by her melodious voice. Then he smiled mischievously. "Flora, my dear, long time no see. It sounds like you've become even more beautiful since we last spoke." Flora laughed, knowing he was flattering her on purpose. But how could his praise not make her happy?
"You sure know how to charm, Mr. Rudd."
"You don't have to do that.
You know I'm here to help you with anything you need. No buttering up is necessary."
"I'm not buttering you up." "Okay, fine. You're right. I do need your help," George said. "Brian Grant has a daughter named Gina who got in trouble for helping me. He's locked her in their house, so I need you to call Mr. Grant and ask him to release her. Also, pass along my gratitude to Gina for her help, but don't say it too directly, and don't mention my name."
"Okay, Mr. Rudd. Consider it done,"
Flora said respectfully. George hung up and sat in his car, waiting to hear good news from her. Flora thought for a moment before calling the most suitable person to handle the situation.
"Hello, Mr. Thomas. I'm sorry to bother you, but Mr. Rudd needs your help."
Then she told him everything George had just told her. After listening to Flora, Mr. Thomas asked his assistant to dial Mr. Grant's number. Mr. Grant was at home, reading a newspaper on the sofa when the phone rang in the living room. He looked at the unfamiliar number and wondered who it could be. With a hint of curiosity, but no hesitation, he picked up the phone.
Hello? May I ask who you're calling for?
Hello, Mr. Grant. It's Mr. Thomas, he answered, wasting no time hiding his identity. Mr. Grant was stunned. He had gotten a call from Mr. Thomas, one of the most influential people in the city. This was too unbelievable.
Mr. Thomas, hello. It's an honor to receive a call from you personally. I've always admired you. You're my idol.
As he spoke, it occurred to him that something must be wrong for Mr. Thomas to call him out of the blue like this. A bit perturbed, he asked,
What can I do for you?
Mr. Thomas smiled and said calmly,
I hear you've locked your daughter Gina up at home. What's going on?
He already knew the answer, but he asked anyway so that Mr. Grant would follow his instructions. Mr. Grant didn't understand why Mr. Thomas cared so much about the matter, but he still explained respectfully.
My little girl's caused some trouble after teaching a lesson to that Fuller boy. His father reported it to me, so I have grounded her as punishment.
That Fuller brat is just asking for a lesson, Mr. Thomas sneered. Mr. Grant felt a bit uneasy and didn't know how to reply, but Mr. Thomas went on.
You don't need to lock your daughter up at home. There are some things you should turn a blind eye to. I really like how genuine and helpful your daughter is, and I need to thank her for helping me take care of someone.
Although he didn't understand everything Mr. Thomas said, he understood some of it. Terry deserved what he got, and Gina didn't deserve to be imprisoned. But what did that last sentence mean? Since when did Gina know Mr. Thomas? And how had she helped in order to earn his gratitude? Episode 108, The Investigation. By the time Mr. Grant decided to stop puzzling out Mr. Thomas's meaning and just ask him outright, the other man had already hung up.
Oh my God, he exclaimed. What am I doing? I got so distracted Mr. Thomas must think I'm rude.
He wanted to make up for being impolite, so he dialed Mr. Thomas's number again. The phone rang a few times before giving a busy signal, so he put down the phone. Then he knocked twice on Gina's door.
Darling, it's Dad.
When he got no response after a minute, he opened the door and walked in.
Dad, you can't just barge in. It's bad enough that you have me locked up in here. Can I just have some privacy in my own room, at least?
Gina huffed. She sat in the bed with her back to him. Mr. Grant wasn't surprised by her tone or her complaint. He smiled guiltily and said in a placating tone,
I was wrong to ground you, darling. You're free to go wherever you want now. I won't keep you any longer.
Really?
She turned around in surprise.
Really?
He nodded. But, he added hesitantly,
I have to ask you something. I need you to be honest with me. How do you know someone as important as Mr. Thomas? If you tell me, I can invite him for a meal or something when I get the chance.
He knew that once he confirmed Gina's connection to Mr. Thomas, he could look for an opportunity to garner the man's favor. Gina frowned, puzzled.
Mr. Thomas? Who's he, Dad? I don't know what you're talking about.
What? Think about it again, darling. Are you sure you don't know him?
Mr. Grant was becoming anxious. She shook her head.
I really don't know anyone named Mr. Thomas.
Seeing her blank expression, he believed she was telling the truth.
All right, I understand. You're free to go out at any time. I'll be in my study, he said.
But his heart was still troubled. Mr. Thomas said that Gina had taken care of someone for him. Perhaps it was one of Gina's own friends. If that was the case, he would have to tell her to keep taking good care of that friend in the future. But first, he needed to investigate which of his daughter's friends had a relationship with Mr. Thomas. Immediately, Mr. Grant called his assistant, Wyatt, and ordered,
Find out who all of Gina's friends are, and then check which of them are affiliated with Mr. Thomas.
I want a list in 2 hours." After hanging up, Mr. Grant sat in his study, waiting for the results of the investigation. Normally, he wouldn't have thought 2 hours was a long time, but it felt like it passed particularly slowly on this day. When the phone rang, he leaped to answer it. "Did you find anything?" he demanded. "Gina's closest friends are Jason, Jeff, Landon, Lily, and Jess," Wyatt answered. "I know all of those kids and their families, and none of them have any connections with Mr. Thomas. Who else has Gina been hanging around with recently?" Mr. Grant asked. "She has a new friend named George," Wyatt said. "He's a poor, unremarkable student at Harrison University." Mr. Grant frowned. "Then let's investigate this poor student." Not even half an hour later, Wyatt called again, and his voice was filled with surprise. "Mr. Grant, that student seems to have quite a close relationship with the Williams family. He has dined with Flora Williams, and he's friendly with Fritz Williams and Ronald Banks, the manager at the Palace Garden. He also has ties to the owners of Torrent Bar and the Chrysanthemum. The entire family treats the young man with respect. Flora is even his personal assistant." Mr. Grant was surprised as well. "What's his last name?" "It's an uncommon one. Rudd. George Rudd," Wyatt said. George, Mr. Grant muttered to himself. It was true that Rudd was an uncommon surname. He only knew one family in Harrison City that used it, and theirs was a very old and very powerful line, descended from royalty somewhere in Europe. But why would anyone with the last name Rudd run around with members of the Williams family? The Williamses were stewards to the Rudds. A sudden thought flashed through Mr. Grant's mind. That poor student named George must have come from the ancient Rudd family. There's no way that Flora Williams would be an assistant for some random student. If the Williamses respected George, then he must be from that line of Rudds. Mr. Grant was quite shocked. He hung up on Wyatt and called Gina. After her father had freed her earlier, Gina left her room, got in her car, and called George. "I'm free, George. Didn't you say you wanted to take me out to eat? Let's do it now." "All right," he answered happily. "Where should we meet?" "Meet me downtown, and then I'll pick a good restaurant. I'm already on my way," Gina said. "Okay." George hung up and walked out of the dorm with his car keys. He was surprised that Flora had settled the matter so quickly. He had to admit that his assistant was highly efficient. Episode 109. An Interrupted Meal. George met up with Gina downtown, and the two of them went to a Chinese restaurant. "The food here is delicious. Order whatever you'd like. It's my treat," Gina said with a hearty laugh. She sounded like a big sister doting on her little brother. George refused her immediately. "No, you can't do that. I said that I would treat you to a meal, so that's what I'll do." She shrugged indifferently. "It's just a matter of eating. It doesn't matter who's treating. I'm older than you, so it's only fair that I treat you." "That won't do. If you don't let me treat you, then I won't eat with you at all," he insisted. The entire point of asking her out for a meal was so that he could repay her favors. His persistence made her anxious, so she had no choice but to agree. "Oh, all right. You can treat me then." Only then did George smile in satisfaction. He picked up the menu, examined it, and ordered his meal. Then he excused himself to the restroom. That was when Gina's phone rang. She answered, but before she could say anything, her father asked impatiently, "Where are you, darling?" "I'm having dinner with a friend, Dad. What do you need?" she asked apprehensively. "Which friend? Is it your usual group of friends?" he asked. "No, it's a new friend I made recently. His name is George Rudd," Gina said. It was him, a member of the famous Rudd family. Hearing that name made Mr. Grant excited for a moment. But then he was filled with concern and asked nervously, "Darling, do you have enough money to eat with your friend? If not, I'll send you some more. You can even go shopping together after you're done eating." "There's no need. I have money, and we're only out for a meal." Gina's heart was troubled. When had her father become so interested in her? "What's wrong, Dad?
Is there something you need to tell me?
Mr. Grant sensed his daughter's suspicion and tried to find an excuse.
I just want to make it up to you, that's all. I feel bad for locking you up. You don't need to worry about me. Enjoy eating with your friend, darling. Oh, and if you have nothing else to do afterward, you could bring your friend over to the house for a visit.
After they hung up, Gina was puzzled. Why was her father being so nice to her, and even offering to entertain her new friend? The waiter arrived with their dishes, so she decided not to think about the matter anymore and just focus on the meal. "Please enjoy," the waiter said. Gina put down her phone and looked up to see that George had come back. She greeted him warmly.
"You're just in time. Let's eat."
But just then, Terry walked into the restaurant with a beautiful woman at his side. He saw Gina and George talking and laughing, and he was stunned for a few seconds. This wasn't right. Hadn't his father told Mr. Grant what Gina had done? And hadn't her father confined her to her room? Then what was she doing here? Mr. Grant must have lied. Terry was filled with anger. He marched over to George and Gina's table with his companion in tow, looking for trouble.
"Oh, who do we have here?"
He sneered at them.
"Gina, what a coincidence. Meeting you here must be fate."
George and Gina raised their heads when they heard Terry's extremely annoying voice. Gina glared at him.
"You must have some nerve to stand here in front of me. I'm disgusted just looking at you," she snarled.
If it weren't for Terry, her father would not have confined her to her room for half a day.
"What do you mean? Why should it be a problem for me to be here in front of you?" "Oh, that's right. I heard your father locked you up. How did that feel?"
Terry mocked. He glanced at George.
"What are you doing with this trash, Gina? Your father wouldn't be happy if he knew."
"You're so annoying, Terry, but it's funny. You think so highly of yourself, but I've realized that you're just a dog, biting people and marking your territory wherever you go," Gina sneered. "Not only did my dad not lock me up, but he had me treat my friend to a meal and requested that I bring him to my house as a guest."
Terry was stunned again. He never thought a scolding from Gina could be so unpleasant. But even worse, he hadn't imagined that Mr. Grant would lie to his father and set himself up against the Fuller family. Terry couldn't pretend to be calm anymore. He pointed at Gina and opened his mouth to yell at her. But when he saw the fierce look in her eyes, he was afraid. Gina was Brian Grant's daughter. If he were to offend her now, it would bring the conflict between their families to the surface. An insult against her was an insult against her entire family, and the Fullers couldn't afford that fight. Terry swung his outstretched finger toward George instead.
"You piece of trash. I'll teach you a lesson."
He took a step forward, ready to fight. But Gina raised a knife tightly in her hand and stabbed it forcefully into the table, getting his attention. Then she said in a low voice,
"If you dare to touch a single hair on his head, I'll cut off your hand on the spot. I swear I'll do it."
Episode 110, A Surprising Invitation.
You both think you're so superior, threatening me like this,"
Terry sputtered.
"But I'm not afraid of you. I'll show you what I can do."
His whole body trembled with anger. He wanted to slap them both, but he couldn't act rashly. He couldn't afford to offend Gina, and she was protecting George. Gina chuckled.
"What are you going to do? Go home and cry to your father? Go on, you coward. I'm not afraid of you either. If you don't want me to break your hands and feet, then hurry up and scram."
"Just you wait,"
Terry snarled, his face turning red. But he was scared. He turned and walked out of the restaurant without another word. George was moved by what Gina had done. He looked at her and said, "Thank you for standing up for me."
"It was nothing," she said. "You're like a brother to me. There's no need to thank me."
Outside, Terry's companion finally dared to speak.
"Terry, are you all right?"
She was only asking to be polite. None of this had anything to do with her, so having a meal with Terry wouldn't offend Gina. But she knew Gina, and she had heard that her family was very powerful and ruthless. Terry couldn't even compare to Gina. When Terry heard his companion's voice, he was agitated rather than pleased. He had always liked her face, but now he couldn't even look at her.
Don't give me that pitying look. What are you still doing here? Get out of my way, he growled.
The woman forced a smile and said patiently,
I'll leave, but you have to pay me first. I've been accompanying you all day, and I don't work for free.
It's just money, isn't it? Here.
He took out his wallet, grabbed a dozen bills, and tossed them at her.
No, hurry up and get lost.
She wasn't one to refuse money, so she bent down and quickly gathered the bills. She shot him a disdainful look as she walked away, cursing him in her heart. Gina was right. Terry was just a cheap dog, and he deserved all the trouble he got. Terry didn't feel any relief after venting his anger on the woman. He picked up his phone and reluctantly called his father. Only Joseph Fuller could avenge him this time. Mr. Grant sat on the sofa at his house. Now that he knew George's identity, he couldn't calm his racing heart or his restless legs. If he could get in with a big family like the Rudds, his career would skyrocket and his entire family would benefit. He couldn't wait to meet George and get to know him. Time waited for no man, so he had to take action right away. He called Gina again, but before she could even say hello, he said bluntly,
Darling, I've decided to host a dinner for all your friends tonight. Be sure to invite your new friend George.
Gina was stunned. She blinked before responding.
Isn't this a little too sudden, Dad? I haven't even contacted my friends yet.
Mr. Grant laughed. No, of course it's not too sudden. I'm already in the middle of preparing everything. You just need to notify your friends and make sure George comes, he emphasized again.
He didn't want to arouse Gina's suspicions by only inviting George over for dinner, so that was why he suggested inviting all of her friends. But the whole point was to meet George, so he had to make sure the young man came too.
But Dad, It's already decided, darling. I'll set the menu myself. I'll be waiting for you at home.
Gina was confused by her father's abrupt request. She wanted to ask why he insisted on having her friends over for dinner tonight. But by the time she opened her mouth, he had already hung up. She looked helplessly at her phone. What was going on with her father? It was all so strange. George noticed Gina's expression and asked, "What's wrong?"
My dad wants me to invite all my friends over for dinner tonight. I think he's trying to make up for locking me in my room. But he doesn't need to. I've already forgiven him. He's my father, after all.
Mr. Grant's actions made sense to George, and he found himself praising the man. Your father is just trying to make you happy. And what's wrong with that? That's how it is with family. When you wrong someone you love, you want to do something to make up for your mistakes. No matter what he does, your father will always love you. Gina smiled at his words.
You're right, George. Why didn't I think of that? You're so wise for someone so young. You really are something. I'll call on my friends right now and invite them to my house. And you have to come too.
Her praise made George's face turn red with embarrassment. He didn't think he was very wise. He had simply analyzed the situation between Gina and her father correctly. But Gina's happy expression filled him with joy. His words had clearly helped her. Gina picked her phone back up and excitedly called all her friends to invite them to her house for dinner. That evening, she and George returned to her house together. Her other friends had already arrived. George knew them well, and as soon as he and Gina walked in the door, they all started chatting enthusiastically. When Mr. Grant heard excited voices in the entryway, he knew that George had arrived. As the host, he couldn't leave everyone waiting. So he put down the documents in his hand and hurried downstairs to greet his guests. Episode 111. Gina's House.
Gina, you're finally back, Mr. Grant called out as his daughter returned. Everyone is waiting for you. Who is this?
He tried to act nonchalant when he saw George. On the surface, he was calm and collected, but in reality his heart was racing.
He must be that person from the Rudd family, George. He's really here, in my house.
Dad, this is the friend I told you about. His name is George Rudd. George, this is my dad.
Gina introduced the two men.
Mr. Rudd, hello. It's really my pleasure to meet you. Come in. Make yourself at home.
Mr. Grant took the initiative to reach out and take George's hand as he spoke with great enthusiasm. George was a little surprised at how welcoming Gina's father was. He politely shook hands with Mr. Grant and said, "Please call me George. Thank you for welcoming me into your home."
All right, I'll call you George then. Come, dinner's already prepared and waiting for you.
Mr. Grant, still holding George's hand, pulled him into the dining room. He only let go to pull out a chair for George.
Thank you. I can do it myself."
George was feeling a bit overwhelmed and put out a hand, indicating to Mr. Grant that he was fine seating himself. Mr. Grant saw George's expression and thought that he had been seen through. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He quickly realized that George was only nervous about the attention though, and so he allowed himself to relax a bit.
Yes, as I said, make yourself at home. Be comfortable here. No need to be formal. If you're a close friend of Gina's, then you can be considered part of our family. And if you call me Brian, then you won't be an outsider. Now, please, take a seat.
For a moment, George felt awkward. He looked at Gina, who was standing behind her father. Mr. Grant was too enthusiastic for him, not letting go of his hand and even pulling out a chair for him to sit on. He didn't feel very comfortable receiving such courtesy and attention. Gina was curious as to why her father was acting so strangely around George. Was it possible that he thought there was something going on?
George, just take a seat. My dad said that you're part of the family, so there's no need to be standing on ceremony when you're here, Gina said placatingly.
Yes, of course, George replied. He wondered if it was just some initial nerves that would soon disappear, and so he sat down. It would have been even more strange and awkward to continue standing there anyway. As George finally sat down, Mr. Grant personally poured some water for him and offered him all the delicious dishes, fruits, and wines on the table. As they ate, Mr. Grant constantly asked George how his food was. If it didn't taste good enough, he would ask the family chef to cook something else. George was told he could have anything he wanted to eat. Perhaps it was just because Mr. Grant sat opposite George, watching the way he ate and drank, but the look in his eyes caused George's hair to stand on end, and goosebumps to appear on his skin. Facing Mr. Grant's strange treatment, George couldn't bear it any longer. He tried to excuse himself to go to the toilet a few times just to be able to breathe. He half suspected that Mr. Grant would follow him there too. George was really feeling helpless. Why was Gina's father being so warm to him? It was just strange.
Gina,
He was starting to feel distressed, so he wanted to ask Gina for help. But before he could say anything more though, Mr. Grant pulled him away enthusiastically.
George, come with me. I have something special I want to show you. How about it?
George took a deep breath and sighed.
Oh my God,
he screamed in his head.
If this continues, how long will it be until someone comes to save me?
Gina, what's wrong with your father? Why is he acting so weird around George?
Landon asked as the two of them left the dining room. The others had quietly observed the interactions over dinner and felt that something was wrong.
You're asking me? I was going to ask you guys. You were all here before me. What exactly happened to my dad?
Gina rolled her eyes.
When we got here, your dad didn't treat us like this, Jason said with a frown. He just nodded and said that we could do whatever we wanted. And then he went upstairs.
That's right. His attitude toward us was pretty cold, actually, Lily said.
Does your dad think that something is going on between George and you? Jeff joked. Landon added,
Yeah, maybe he has taken a fancy to George and wants him to be his son-in-law. Shut up, guys. No way.
Gina shook her head.
What are you saying? This is a mess. George is several years younger than me.
I just treat him as my younger brother. It's not like that at all. How could she possibly like someone that much younger than her? Besides, she told George that he was to treat her as a big sister. What her friends were suggesting was just rubbish. Gina, are you sure you have no interest in George? I think he's a pretty good guy, said Landon. You've been single for so long, have you actually considered finding a boyfriend? Sometimes if you don't go looking for love, it comes to find you instead. Jeff and Landon both looked at Gina with smirks on their faces and continued to tease her. It seemed that they didn't intend to let this go. With them putting the thought in her head, Gina couldn't help but imagine her and George really walking toward marriage. Her face turned red, and she didn't know what to do with her hands and feet.
Oh, she's blushing. Have we hit the nail on the head?
Jason laughed shamelessly. Gina angrily pushed him away and threatened him. You shut up, or I'll pour all that chili into your mouth.
Haha, okay, I won't say any more. Relax, I was just joking,
Jason said with a smile. When George returned and saw that everyone was happily chatting and laughing, he walked over, happy to get away from Mr. Grant, and tapped Gina on the shoulder. Hey, Gina, he said. What are you guys talking about? What's so funny? Gina turned around and looked at him, his face just inches away. Her own face, which had only just returned to its normal color, turned red again in a second. Gina, what's wrong with you? Are you okay? George asked in confusion. Why is your face so red? Are you not feeling well? Her heart tightened when she heard the caring tone in his face. She immediately lowered her head, not daring to look him in the eye. Episode 112. Cutting Ties. George saw that Gina wasn't saying anything, so he looked at Jeff and the others for help. They looked at each other and then looked back at him with a collection of smirks and smiles, but they didn't say anything. Why are you guys all looking at me like that? George frowned, feeling a little confused. It's nothing. And Gina doesn't have a fever or anything. Come and have a drink, George. It'll be fine. Seeing that the atmosphere wasn't quite right, Jason stepped forward to smooth things over. He picked up a wine glass from the table and handed it to George. Landon and the others also raised their glasses, and there was a chorus of cheers before they all took a drink. At that time, at the Grant family's gate, two uninvited guests arrived, Joseph Fuller and his son Terry. They wanted to enter the home, but were stopped by a security guard at the gate. The Fullers were not pleased with the guard stopping them, and Joseph complained loudly.
You dare stop us from entering? Hurry up and call Mr. Grant. Tell him that Joseph Fuller is here to see him.
Seeing that the two visitors were very well presented and apparently knew Mr. Grant, and hearing the tone of Joseph's voice, the guard only thought about it for a moment before making a call inside. Mr. Grant, he said after the call was picked up, there's a man here to see you. Says his name is Joseph Fuller. Looks like the kid with him might be his son. Let him in, Mr. Grant said indifferently. He didn't need to guess what Joseph wanted to see him about. The guard hung up and immediately opened the gate, allowing Joseph and Terry to enter. The Fullers aggressively headed inside. They wanted an explanation from Mr. Grant. However, before the two of them entered the mansion, they could hear the commotion from inside. When they walked in and saw who was there, they were even more stunned. Come in, sit down. Mr. Grant didn't bother to get up. He just glanced at Joseph and Terry indifferently.
What's going on? Terry wondered. It's one thing for George to not be taught a lesson, but to be invited to Mr. Grant's house to enjoy good wine and food?
Mr. Grant's attitude toward them was neither cold nor welcoming. It was as if they weren't even there.
Mr. Grant, what's the meaning of this?
Terry asked angrily. Nothing, Mr. Grant answered without even looking at him. At that moment, Terry felt like he had never been so humiliated. His thoughts were spinning in his head.
How can Mr. Grant treat George like this? He's someone who he should be embarrassed to be seen with. It's fine if he doesn't punish his daughter, but he can't give him that much attention.
The key was that George was just poverty-stricken trash. Terry couldn't understand how Mr. Grant could just overlook that. He wanted to curse at Mr. Grant, but he was too embarrassed to do so. So he turned to George instead, intending to make things difficult for him.
"George, you piece of trash! Why are you here?" he spat. "Have you run out of money again? Won't your conscience hurt if you keep cheating people out of theirs? What's it all about? Is being a waiter not enough for you to survive?"
George just stood there looking at him, so Terry continued.
"Why aren't you talking? That's right. How can you have the nerve to speak now that I've exposed you? You poor bastard. You don't have any money, right? I'll give you some, to show you how charitable I can be."
As he spoke, Terry took out a few notes from his pocket and threw them in George's direction.
"You beggar. Take the money that I've given you and get out of here. Don't let me see you again, you disgusting thing."
Mr. Grant was unwilling to listen to any more. His face was so dark that it couldn't possibly get any darker.
"He's from the Rudd family," he screamed internally. "And you dare to offend him in my house?"
Keeping his calm in front of his guests, however, Mr. Grant just motioned for his housekeeper to approach.
"Wilkins, go and call the security guards in to kick this uneducated lout out of my house." His voice was low but very intimidating.
Hearing this instruction, Joseph angrily rushed over to put his face close to Mr. Grant's.
"What do you mean by this? Did I really just hear you insult my son?"
"Your son was rude to the guests I have invited into my home." Mr. Grant squinted his eyes and looked at Joseph sharply.
"Mr. Grant, don't go too far. It was that brat who got your daughter to bully my son."
Joseph grimaced as he argued, spittle flying everywhere.
"You say that my daughter bullied your son, and then you come here to try to bully me. Why do I feel that your son's the one causing trouble here?"
Mr. Grant wasn't stupid, and he had already investigated the truth of the matter. How could he believe Joseph and Terry's nonsense?
"Mr. Grant, do you still want to work with our family?"
Joseph angrily retorted.
"If you don't give me an explanation right now, then the cooperation between our two families will come to an end."
From Joseph's point of view, it was impossible for Mr. Grant to abandon the cooperation between the two families, just because of a poor student who had a falling out with them. Moreover, this collaboration could be considered a big deal to the Grant family. Mr. Grant was a businessman with a lot of interests, and he knew that if he dropped the Fuller name into conversation now and then, he could often get further in his business dealings. Terry was a little surprised that his father was going this far for him. He glanced at George and Gina complacently. George and the others looked at each other, and Gina stepped forward to talk. Mr. Grant waved his hand at her and said,
"Sit down, everyone. You should eat and drink. I'll take care of them."
Is he threatening us now?
Terry wondered.
Not only is he not giving us the answers we came for, but he doesn't seem bothered about cutting ties with Dad's business.
"Wilkins, have the guards arrived yet? If not, you can kick this pair out yourself. If they don't leave, you don't need to be polite with them. Just do whatever you need to do."
Mr. Grant waved a nonchalant hand in the direction of the Fullers.
"Yes, Mr. Grant."
Wilkins opened the door as the security guards arrived and indicated for them to remove the Fullers from the premises.
"What? Mr. Grant, are you sure you want to do this?"
Joseph was stupefied. He had never expected that it would come to this. Terry was also shocked. He had thought that Mr. Grant would be mollified by the threat of breaking up their business ties because of his defense of George. Joseph and Terry had no choice but to leave. Before doing so, though, they continued their threats.
"Mr. Grant, you'll regret this," shouted Joseph. "When the time comes, even if you beg to cooperate with me, I won't agree."
I never do anything that I regret, Mr. Grant coolly responded. He cared a lot more about what the Rudd family thought of him than the Fuller family, so he was willing to do whatever it took to stand up for George at that moment. After Joseph and Terry left, George felt a bit guilty. He had thought that the grudge between him and Terry's family had been resolved. The more George thought about it, the more uncomfortable he became, since the Grant family was now involved and had even lost some business dealings because of him. He stood up from his seat and walked over to Mr. Grant. Mr. Grant, Brian, is your business going to be okay? You really don't need to make enemies with them because of me. Episode 113. Pick a side. George, it's okay, Mr. Grant said. I said you're part of the family, and if you're being bullied, I'm there to help you. If Joseph Fuller chooses to mix business with personal matters like this, then it's not worth working with him. Even if we cooperate in the future, when he goes back on his word, our family will suffer. Mr. Grant patted George on the shoulder to comfort him while smiling reassuringly at Gina and her other friends. George, what my dad did is right, Gina said. You're my honorary brother, so you're one of us now. If we don't stand up for you, then who else will? Yeah, George, Jason chimed in. Mr. Grant was very wise. Not only did he protect you, but he also used this matter to quickly see through those people. He did it so that he wouldn't have to work with them in the future and be subjected to their shameless acts. Is that so? George asked uncertainly. Landon saw that George was still in a low mood, so he went up to him and tried to cheer him up. Don't worry. Mr. Grant will be fine if he says he will. Don't think about it too much. George thought about that and felt that it was reasonable. He no longer felt guilty and eventually sat down with everyone again. Mr. Grant joined in with the chat a bit more this time. They had a lot of fun blowing off steam after the unexpected visit. The night was getting darker, and the atmosphere in the Fuller home was getting tense. Dad, I can't accept this, Terry said.
If you don't want to, then so be it,
Joseph said with an ugly expression.
It's my fault for not being able to fight with the Grant family.
What Joseph said was the truth. Even though Mr. Grant's power in Harrison City wasn't that strong, it was at least power that had been handed down through an established family, and held a certain amount of weight within the business circles of the city. The Fuller family had only risen up recently, so naturally they couldn't compare to the Grant family. It had been difficult for them to find a project recently, but they had eventually found a chance to work together with Mr. Grant, to earn some big money and gain some further connections. Now, because of his disappointing son, that opportunity had been lost. Ever since Joseph left the Grant family home, he had been regretting his actions and his outburst. Terry didn't expect his father to admit defeat, and his face revealed a look of disappointment.
Dad, don't you think that the Grant family has gone too far? We should think of a way to get them into trouble so we can get our own back. Otherwise, if this gets out, how many people will mock us? You still have the nerve to say that when it was you provoking Gina that caused all this in the first place? You've caused all my work with Mr. Grant to disappear.
Joseph felt a bit of resentment as he looked at Terry. He quickly had to look away again as he started to feel irritated.
Dad, how can you say that about me?
Terry's expression was filled with shock. Why did his father suddenly turn into someone else? Shouldn't he be on his son's side?
Humph. It would be best if you don't cause too much trouble in the future,
Joseph snorted coldly. He didn't bother to look at Terry anymore. He just turned around and went upstairs. Terry was furious. How could his father treat him like that?
Fine,
he thought angrily.
If you're too scared to get revenge, then I'll do it myself.
He took his father's car keys and hurriedly left the house.
Mr. Young, I want to ask for your help,
Terry said to the tattooed man in front of him and the crown.
a dark and disreputable bar in the city?
Yes, what is it? Mr. Young sat on the sofa and smoked a cigar. He exhaled a smoke ring and looked at Terry lazily. I want you to break someone's leg for me. How much will it cost?
Terry's face was full of viciousness. After a moment of silence, he added,
Gina Grant is involved with this person somehow. Will you be able to accept the job?
Gina, Mr. Young said, sitting back. That woman is not only tough to deal with, but she's also known to be ruthless. Whoever dares to provoke her might be biting off more than they can chew.
Then are you saying that you won't do it?
Terry's voice immediately took on a bitter edge.
Gina and her friends have gone too far. Actually going against me for the sake of this poor guy.
Seeing Terry's bitter face, Mr. Young suddenly laughed. Tell me how you offended her.
I didn't mess with her. She's the one who's calling a poor guy from our school her little brother. His name is George. I wouldn't usually need any help with this, but now he has Gina's protection. I can't get close to him myself. Can you really not accept this job?
Terry pleaded. Actually, it's not impossible. It's very easy to get to a poor student. As long as you clean up behind you, no one would ever know. If Gina wants to check, she won't be able to find anything. Mr. Young smiled playfully. However, the price for this is much higher than usual. Are you sure you can afford it?
As long as you can break one of George's legs, I'm willing to pay $10,000.
Terry clenched his teeth as he named his price. Only $10,000? Mr. Young chuckled and shook his head. It looks like you don't really want revenge. For that little money, forget about breaking his leg. Maybe I can break one of his toes for you. Mr. Young laughed for a minute, but Terry remained silent. If you dare to provoke Gina Grant, once she discovers you, I can guarantee that she'll be even more ruthless than me, Mr. Young continued. By then, even if I want to run away, I won't be able to. Your money's not enough for me to risk my life. What's more, this person isn't just an ordinary kid. If Gina's calling him her little brother, if she finds out I broke his leg, she could do a lot worse to me. He smiled coldly. Another thug who was standing beside Mr. Young leaned forward and looked at Terry.
Don't think he's making it up. About that woman being ruthless. A few days ago, someone touched her friend in a bar, and she found someone to break all his fingers.
There you go, said Mr. Young. You heard it. I don't have any excuse to scare you. Everyone knows about this woman. If you don't believe me, you can go ask around. He shrugged and chuckled as Terry looked around bewildered. Episode 114. A Memorable Encounter. A bloody scene suddenly appeared in Terry's mind. He was so scared that his whole body was shivering. His face was pale as he muttered,
That's too scary. Surely Gina can't be that cruel.
He didn't want to be treated like that by Gina. Even if he didn't die, he wouldn't be able to live with the embarrassment of being beaten up at the behest of a young woman. He was too young to throw his life away like that. He hadn't played enough with the women of the world.
Mr. Young, you can ask for as much money as you want. I'm willing to give anything.
Terry was anxious at that moment. He gritted his teeth as he spoke. Mr. Young puffed on his cigar for a few moments, and then leaned forward and said, 50. I'll break this kid's leg for 50,000, and I'll make sure that your name stays out of it. His face split in a sinister smile.
So much?
Terry opened his mouth in shock. Seeing the look on Mr. Young's face, he quickly backtracked.
That's fine. I'll get it for you, but I don't have that much money right now. I can give you 5,000 now, and then the other 45,000 when it's done.
Mr. Young's eyes became even colder. No way. I'll want at least 30,000 for a partial payment.
Okay, fine. I'll call someone to borrow some money.
Terry made up his mind. He picked up his phone and started to call his friends to borrow money. It took him a while, but he was eventually able to collect another $25,000 and transfer it to Mr. Young's account.
Right, the money's been transferred over to you, Terry said, looking at Mr. Young nervously.
Since I've received the money, don't worry about a thing. I'll break the leg of that little bastard in the next 2 days. And I can guarantee that Gina won't be able to find out it was anything to do with you, Mr. Young said, patting his chest in a satisfied manner. Terry finally felt relieved, and a happy smile appeared on his face. He was in a good mood as he picked up the bottle of beer on the table and started drinking. Mr. Young looked at the balance of his account and was a bit excited. He never thought that Terry would be so straightforward with his money. $30,000. Barely even blinking an eye. These rich kids are so easy to part from their money. Give me the boy's information, he said out loud. I'll go pay him a visit in the next 2 days. Terry put down his bottle and told Mr. Young everything he knew about George. He even took out his phone to let Mr. Young look at a photo. Mr. Young nodded in understanding and knew what he had to do. After the two of them finished talking business, they happily continued drinking. Mr. Young even called 2 beauties over to sit beside Terry. Terry spent the evening happily chatting in their company. On the evening of the first day, Mr. Young and his men hid in the car park of Harrison University, waiting for George to appear. Since things had taken a bit of a turn the day before, Gina's friends had invited George to a bar for a drink. They figured they would be more at ease without Mr. Grant around, and definitely without the Fullers. George felt that Jason and the others were all worth making friends with, so he agreed without any hesitation. After his afternoon class, he walked into the parking lot and took out his keys. Before he reached his car, he was stopped by Mr. Young and the others. "Where are you going, my friend?" Mr. Young led the others slowly into George's path, a malicious smile on his face. "Why don't you take us with you?" When George saw these people, he knew they weren't going to be easy to deal with. He blinked and said, "Sure, let's get in the car." Then he turned and opened the door, letting Mr. Young and the others enter before he finally got in himself. So who exactly are you?" George asked as he drove the car out of the school gates. Mr. Young glanced at him but didn't say anything. George knew he was asking for trouble, so he didn't say anything more. He was about to turn onto a quiet road but thought better of it and instead turned the car around to a place with more people. Noticing something was wrong, Mr. Young took out a knife and pointed it at George's waist. "If you don't want to die, turn back," he said coldly. George felt the knife on his waist and felt a chill down his spine. He didn't resist and didn't say anything. He just turned the car around. When they got to a remote place with no one around, Mr. Young ordered in a cold voice, "Stop! This'll do. You can get out now." George stopped the car and got out immediately. The moment he did, he was dragged rudely into an alley by Mr. Young. It was already dark, and the alley was so dark that the road couldn't be seen clearly. At that moment, the sound of footsteps and curses came from nearby. Hearing the voice, George felt that it sounded familiar. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Mr. Long and his crew. "Mr. Long, why are you guys here as well?" George shouted in hope. Mr. Long raised his head and looked at the person in front of him. He quickly saw that it was George. He also saw the people surrounding George and the knife one of them held. "George, why are you playing out here? I didn't expect to see you here. It's been too long." Mr. Long turned to his men and gave a signal. They fanned out behind him as he slowly walked toward George. "Mr. Long, as you can see, I'm a little tied up right now." George greeted him with a pleading look in his eyes. "But I've been meaning to come to see you to give you my news. I've just been busy recently and haven't had the time, but I got a BMW and I want to show my appreciation of you."
Mr. Young and his men looked at Mr. Long and his team. Neither crew looked easy to deal with.
"Kid, you better get them to leave this place as soon as possible,"
Mr. Young threatened in a low voice, leaning close to George's ear. "I'm afraid that that's not going to be possible," George said happily. "My friend here's Mr. Long. He's what you might call a gangster. I heard that he has a particularly strong gang leader in Harrison City looking after him. I can't afford to offend him." George's eyes flickered as he pretended to be troubled by this. Mr. Young's heart sank. If this newcomer really had the support of a Harrison City crime gang, he couldn't afford to offend him either. He really didn't expect that this brat would know such a character. It seemed that he wouldn't be able to deal with George that day. Even if he could, he wouldn't dare to. If he had offended the Grant family, he could still find a place to hide for a while. After the news died down, he could always come out again. But if he offended the gang leader who was the most feared in all of Harrison, then no matter where he hid, they would find him. Seeing that Mr. Long was about to walk up to him, Mr. Young quickly put away the knife he had been holding against George's waist and gave a look to the people around him, indicating that they were leaving. Episode 115, George's Revenge. George saw Mr. Young put away his knife, and he felt relieved. Seeing that Mr. Young and the others were planning to leave, he quickly whispered in Mr. Long's ears, "Help me. I want to know who sent these people to mess with me. You'll get a reward." When Mr. Long heard this, he was very interested. "All of you, stay here," he shouted. His crew quickly surrounded Mr. Young and the others. "What do you want?" Mr. Young's expression turned ugly. "We don't want to do anything. We just want to know who sent you to mess with my friend George here. If you say who it was, then we'll let you go. If you don't, then naturally there will be no good ending for you." Mr. Long looked at Mr. Young with a smile that was not quite a smile. He waved his hand, and his men all took out knives and clubs from wherever they had been hiding them. Mr. Young couldn't help but be shocked when he saw this situation. There was a dozen of them against his 5. He fell into silence, struggling with his dilemma. If he didn't say anything, his day would have a really bad ending. If he did, then he could forget about Terry's 50,000. "Don't waste my time. I'll give you another 5 seconds. If you don't give me a name, I'll beat the crap out of you." Mr. Long's fake smile somehow grew even wider as he spoke. Seeing this, Mr. Young shuddered. He knew that the person in front of him was not joking with him. "I'll tell you," Mr. Young said through gritted teeth. "It was a man with the surname Watson. As for his first name, he didn't tell us. He just told us to break the leg of a man named George, and he would give us some money." A man with the surname Watson, George thought for a while. Other than his classmate Alex, he didn't know anyone with the surname Watson. And Alex wouldn't get mixed up with people like this. George looked at Mr. Young again, but the thug looked away, avoiding his gaze. He concluded that he was lying and said so to Mr. Long. "He's lying. I don't know anyone called Watson." "My friend says you are lying," Mr. Long said. His seemingly pleasant expression changed to an outright evil one. "It seems like you think we're mugs who you can just say anything to. Let's see how you like it when we break your legs." He motioned his men to advance on Mr. Young. Don't, Mr. Young hurriedly cried out. "I'll be honest, I swear. It was some guy named Terry." "It's him," George and Mr. Long said at the same time. George was surprised, but Mr. Long even more so. He looked at George meaningfully. "Well, I didn't think that spoiled brat would go against you. But he seems intent on finding trouble with you time and time again." "He does," George agreed, nodding. He didn't expect Terry to hate him so much that he would find someone to break his legs. Mr. Long, let them go. I'll personally settle this matter with Terry. These are the keys to the BMW. Here." George took out his car keys and put them in Mr. Long's hand. Then he turned around and left. Mr. Long was surprised, as he didn't expect George to give him the car keys so readily. Seeing George walk away, he waved his hand and let Mr. Young and the others go. George stopped a taxi at the intersection and got in. He picked up his phone to call Flora. "Hey, Flora. Terry hired someone to break my leg. I think I need some people to protect me now, and I'll deal with Terry while I'm at it." Getting someone to break Terry's legs in return was something he couldn't tolerate. But if he didn't think of a way to deal with Terry now, this would go on forever. "Okay, I understand," Flora said in a serious tone. "Where are you now? I'll send someone over." "Thanks, Flora." George thought about it for a second and changed his mind. "Actually, I'll go to the White Rose Hotel. There are people from the Williams family there too, so you don't need to send anyone over. With Fritz and the others there, it'll be enough to teach Terry a lesson." Saying that, George told the driver where he wanted to go and then texted Terry, telling him that if he wanted the keys to the BMW, he would need to meet with him at the White Rose Hotel. After George hung up the phone, Flora's expression turned pale. She picked up the phone again and called Fritz at the White Rose Hotel to explain the situation. George rushed over to the hotel, opened the doors, and saw Fritz and the others waiting for him. He didn't need to think about it to know what was going on. Flora must have talked to Fritz on the phone before he got there. He walked in and nodded to Fritz silently, and the others followed as the two of them marched through the hotel. At that moment, George had become the center of attention. When he looked back, he thought he had a heroic aura about him. Terry was sitting in a room, playing around with his friends. When he heard the phone on the table beep, he picked it up and saw that it was a text message from George. The message said that he would return his BMW keys. Terry didn't doubt him and quickly said goodbye to his friends and left for the hotel. His BMW was worth a lot of money. How could he not be in a hurry to get it back? And if George was actually going to voluntarily hand him his keys back, that was even better. Terry arrived at the hotel, and as soon as he walked in, the concierge asked, "Excuse me, are you Terry Fuller?" "I am." Terry was a little confused, but nodded anyway. "Please, follow me. George has been waiting for you for a long time," the man said with a smile. Terry didn't think too much as he followed the concierge inside. He thought to himself that he should get his car keys back and then extort a nice meal from George at this hotel. Although the White Rose Hotel couldn't compare to the Palace Garden restaurant, it was still one of Harrison's most luxurious hotels. A meal here would still cost a lot of money. Terry thought his plan was quite beautiful, but when he entered the room, not only did his plan disappear, but he had a sack thrown over his head, and then someone gave him a fierce beating. Terry was in so much pain that he complained incessantly. What's going on? Who are you? You don't want to live anymore, do you? Do you know who I am? I'm Terry Fuller, the son of Joseph Fuller. You all..." A punch to the gut stopped Terry from saying anything more. The more he tried to shout out, the more he got beaten up. After a while, he didn't even have the strength to struggle anymore, let alone shout. George frowned. He thought for a moment that Terry had been killed, and immediately motioned for someone to take the sack off his head. He saw that Terry was still alive, just beaten senseless. "Go get some water and splash it on his face," George instructed. Very quickly, a bottle of cold water was brought over and poured onto the stunned Terry. He was instantly jolted awake by the water, looked around, saw George, and then immediately started cursing at him. Episode 116. Calling for Help. Terry was in so much pain, he was having difficulty standing up. Still, he took the deepest breath he could manage and shouted, "George!
Were you behind this? You told them to beat me up?
George snorted coldly. You're one to talk. Don't get mad at me for using your idea. It's not such a great situation, is it? Terry's face froze, and he looked around the room wildly, panicking. George didn't seem to have a single scratch or bruise on him. But if he hadn't been hurt, how did he know that Terry had hired someone to go after him? Someone must have told them. But who?
George, what are you talking about?
Terry wheezed.
What a desperate way to try to change the subject. What are you saying? I put a hit out on you or something? That would be nuts. And illegal. Who would do something like that?
He knew that no matter what, he needed to do everything possible to avoid admitting that he had tried to do just that. He could see Gina in his mind's eye, looking fierce and unforgiving. If she found out, it would be the death of him. George smiled. So, you don't want to admit it? If that's the case, then I guess we have to keep going. If you go for my legs, I'll go for yours. At his words, Fritz signaled one of the fighters behind him to step up. The man carried a large club in his hands, and he held it up threateningly.
Are you kidding me?
Terry screamed.
You wouldn't dare. You know who my father is. Do you think some poor nobody like you can get away with treating me like this? I'm Joseph Fuller's son. I don't know how you got Gina on your side, but she won't be enough to protect you.
He yelled all this at George, but his eyes never left the club in the man's hands. He couldn't imagine how painful it would feel to be hit by something so heavy. He wondered if the blow would leave him walking with a limp forever. He scrambled on the floor, unable to get away but writhing desperately nonetheless.
Don't come near me. Once my dad finds out, he's the one you'll be fighting.
You know what? Call him now, said George with a casual shrug. I want to see what he'll do to protect you. Terry clenched his teeth, furious at having his threat called out. But he pulled his phone out of his pocket and dialed his father as quickly as he could. As soon as he heard his father pick up the phone, he began crying.
You have to help me. They're going to beat me to death.
What? Terry, where are you?
Joseph yelled back, horrified.
Track my phone. You have to get here as soon as possible. George is saying he's going to break my legs.
Terry sobbed.
He won't,
Joseph promised him.
It'll be the last thing he ever does. I'm heading there now. Just wait for me.
Swearing, he hung up the phone.
Dad, when you get here...
Terry tried to continue, but he heard the flat tone as the call disconnected. Joseph had yelled loudly enough that George had been able to hear his words from across the room. He wasn't worried about any of the man's threats. Teaching Terry a lesson was already pleasure enough, but getting to deal with both father and son at the same time would be a joy. Maybe if he made his point forcefully enough, they would stop messing with him. Joseph made more calls as he rushed to the inn, gathering more men to support him. He didn't know how someone like George had managed to get the support of Gina Grant, or anyone from such a wealthy family, but he didn't care. He was determined to teach him a lesson for threatening his son. 35 minutes later, he arrived at the inn with a group of supporters. They burst in aggressively, shouting for George to come out and leave Terry alone. One of the thugs even grabbed a waiter and shook him, demanding to know where George was. Joseph was dressed in a polished suit and usually presented himself as someone refined. But now, he didn't care. He shouted and swore and raged, utterly careless of his image. But someone came out to greet him, and the sight of that person made him stop cold.
Fritz Williams?
He sputtered. Fritz inclined his head to him.
Mr. Fuller,
he said, in a tone that just barely hinted at respect.
My goodness, what a bad mood you're in.
Joseph's whole body stiffened. Beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. He swallowed nervously and tried to smile.
Mr. Williams, what a coincidence to find you here. What brings you here today?
This is my hotel, Fritz said coldly.
I was just looking for someone named George,
Joseph continued. I know where he is. Please, allow me. Fritz turned away, preparing to lead Joseph and his men to the room George had asked for. George had arranged this with him previously. He wanted a private room so he could finish dealing with Terry and his father.
Thank you,
said Joseph, lowering his eyes humbly.
Please, lead the way.
Fritz was turned away so Joseph couldn't see him, but his eyes flashed with malice. He led Joseph and his supporters through the halls until they reached the room. The moment the door opened and Joseph saw the scene inside, his heart sank. Just looking around, it was clear why his son had called. He was vastly outnumbered. The room was filled with threatening-looking people, too many to count quickly. Terry quaked in the middle of it all, bruised and pathetic.
Dad,
he cried.
You're finally here. You have to help me. They said they're going to beat me to death.
He got a look at the people his father had brought along, and his face flooded with relief.
Oh, great. You brought people. We can fight. You can get me out of here. Hurry up and help me.
But then Fritz said, Mr. Fuller, please take a seat. He said it politely as if it was a suggestion, but Joseph knew it was anything but. He felt his stomach clench in anticipation. Without a word, he walked to the seat Fritz indicated and sat down. George was waiting for him. As soon as Joseph spotted him, his face darkened with fury.
This is going too far. How dare you touch my son?
He started it, George replied. He hired someone to attack me. It's just lucky I already knew there was trouble coming my way, or else this situation would be much, much worse for Terry right now. Joseph scowled ferociously. Why shouldn't I retaliate? George continued calmly. And what are you going to do about it? Don't forget, I've still got Terry in my hands. Should you be speaking to me that way? As soon as he was finished with this little speech, his supporters stepped forward, glaring down at Joseph as if he were their prey. Joseph turned his glare in Terry's direction. He couldn't believe Terry hadn't done more to warn him on the phone that George had brought a great deal of manpower into the room. The supporters that Joseph had gathered on his way there wouldn't be nearly enough to get him and Terry out safely. Episode 117. Proof of Guilt. As he glared around the room, searching for answers, Joseph began to notice that the clothes and symbols worn by the people behind George were very familiar. After a few moments of uncertainty, he realized he had seen them somewhere before. Usually, they worked for Fritz. It only took another moment to spot Fritz standing off to the side, smiling coldly. Joseph was confused. He didn't understand what the connection was between Fritz and George. Why was Fritz supporting him? George was nobody. He had no money, no power. He wasn't supposed to have any strong connections of any kind. Why was Fritz siding with him? He had investigated George before. Nothing in the reports had indicated a connection between George and the Williams family. But he also knew he didn't have time to sit and wonder about this now. Right now, he needed to bargain for his son Terry's safety.
That's a big accusation,
he finally said.
You claim my son hired someone to hurt you. But do you have any proof? A document? A contract? A receipt? Am I supposed to just take your word for it? You're not even harmed. This seems like a completely made-up story.
George smiled playfully. You want evidence? Sure, I can give you that. He took his cell phone out of his pocket and began to play the recording of the conversation describing the contract taken out against him. At the end of the description, Terry was explicitly mentioned as the person who had hired them. George had taken care to get this recording in secret, knowing that he would need it whether he was beaten up or not. He had been very lucky to be saved by Mr. Long, who had just been passing by when it was all taking place. Finding out who had taken out the contract on him in the first place had been an unexpected bonus. Joseph's face became gloomy as he listened to the recording. It was exactly the kind of proof he had hoped George wouldn't have. It was clear, explicit, and detailed. He couldn't even pretend the conversation was referencing some other unknown Terry. He understood his son very well. Hiring someone to attack George was exactly the sort of thing he would do. But he also knew that if he abandoned his son and agreed he was guilty now, Terry could end up having his legs broken or worse. He turned to Terry and said,
"Son, I want to ask you a question. Will you be honest with me?"
He blinked a few times, giving his son a meaningful look. He hoped Terry would understand the signal. It was a weak plan, but he hoped that Terry would continue to deny the accusations. If he screamed enough that he was innocent, maybe Joseph could get him out of the hotel in one piece on the argument that there was enough reason to doubt his guilt. But Terry was glaring at him incredulously.
"Dad, why are you just sitting there? You brought people. Use them. Beat him up. Look at what he's already done to me. Aren't you furious?" "Just answer the question,"
Joseph growled at him. He couldn't believe his son was wasting time begging him to start a fight when there were smarter ways to get them both out of trouble. He began to wonder if he had raised an idiot. If he was too stupid to think of a way to talk himself out of trouble, then maybe it wasn't worth trying to help him. At this point, there wasn't much that he could do to help him anyway. Terry was confused and disappointed at his father's lack of action. When screaming didn't make him spring up and attack, he fell into confused silence, not daring to look his father in the eye. George and Fritz exchanged a look. They each understood what Joseph was trying to do, but it didn't seem worth stepping in. So instead, they waited and watched as the pathetic little drama played out. There was a long, long silence as Terry sat mullishly and refused to talk. Finally, George was bored. He said, "Terry, you're such a coward. Your money means absolutely nothing. Why should I care if you pay people to try to hurt me? You can't do a single thing for yourself. You're pathetic." His disdainful words roused the fury in Terry that had fallen quiet. The anger quickly went to his head.
"So what if I did pay somebody?" he snapped. "Kill me if you think you've got the guts. But you don't. You'd never go that far."
George smirked at him. "It would be funny if I did though, right? After all your bragging." He turned to Joseph with a shrug. "You heard what he said, right? He's admitted it. He even invited me to kill him. I don't want to do that though. I don't think we need to do any more than what he originally paid that guy to do to me. What was it, Terry? A broken leg?"
"You're going too far, George,"
Joseph roared fearfully. George waved a hand and one of his people stepped forward. He positioned the club over Terry's leg and looked at George as if asking for approval. Nothing had even touched him yet, but Terry was already screaming that the pain was too much. He was frozen to the spot, hands raised as if to stop the club from coming down on his leg. Joseph sprung up, pointing at George wildly.
"Don't you dare! If you touch my son, I'll fight you myself."
Fritz stepped forward. "Mr. Fuller, are you saying you want to fight? Are you sure that's what you want?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small gun. He raised his arm and pointed the barrel of it at Joseph's head. Joseph took a step back, hissing in a breath.
"What are you doing? How dare you point that thing at me?"
"I dare," Fritz said simply. "Would you like to test my patience?"
Episode 118. A Humble Apology.
"Your patience?"
Joseph cried, torn between fear and disbelief.
I'm the one having to be patient here. This young upstart nobody has the nerve to threaten me and order people to hurt my son. I came here to talk.
His eyes were fixed on Fritz's gun. He didn't dare to look anywhere else. So he didn't see Fritz's leg snake out to kick him behind the knee, knocking him down to kneel on the ground. The attack caught him off guard, and he cried out in pain as his knees hit the floor hard.
Dad,
Terry yelled.
are you all right?
He glared up at Fritz.
Who are you? Don't you dare treat my dad like that. I'll fight you myself.
But as he said that, the thug holding the club over his leg made a quick move, as if he were about to finally strike his calf and break the bone there. Terry flinched back, screaming in fear. The men Joseph Fuller had brought with him as support hung back by the door. One stepped forward half-heartedly, as if he might intervene, but Joseph pointed at him and howled.
You stay back. It's way too late for any of you to bother stepping in.
The members of the group gave each other uncertain, shifty looks. Finally, they all took another few steps back. Joseph turned his gaze back to Fritz. The man still had his gun trained on him and was staring down at him with an icy expression.
Please, if you have something to say, I'm all ears, Mr. Williams.
Joseph's mind was going wild, trying to think of a way to get out of the situation. He knew he had misjudged everything horribly. The sound of his son panicking on the phone had made him panic in turn, and now they were both stuck. He had no idea what the relationship was between Fritz and George, but George had a lot more power and influence than Joseph had previously understood. But Fritz didn't answer him. Instead, he called over his shoulder to George.
What would you like me to do?
Joseph noted the change in his tone. He sounded utterly respectful, as if George wasn't just someone he was helping, but someone he answered to and obeyed absolutely. Joseph knew that if he made it out of this situation alive, he needed to completely rewrite his estimation of George. He wasn't just some poor classmate at his son's university. Whoever he was, he had great influence. I don't know what I want to do with them yet, George said, looking from Joseph to Terry and back. I have to think about it. Joseph took this as a cue.
Please, I would like to humbly apologize on behalf of myself and my son. He will never give you trouble again, neither will I.
George raised his eyebrows. Wow, it's a big honor to have somebody like you apologize to me. After all, I'm just some nobody. I heard you on the phone before. Weren't you going to break my arms and legs or something? Joseph felt like he was going to be sick as George began relaying everything he had overheard from Terry's desperate phone call to his father. He was rapidly running out of ideas. Terry began struggling to stand up.
George, it's fine if you attack me, but leave my dad out of this.
George turned and gave him an amazing look. You're the one who called your father and begged him to come out here to help you. You got him involved, not me. Since when are you ready for a fight? You were crying 2 seconds ago. The whole thing was making him remember a very similar scene with Ben and Robert Davison, a similarly rich, obnoxious father-son duo who had been giving George problems. Maybe this was just what happened when rich, entitled men were allowed to run rampant, without ever experiencing hardship. George felt a sudden pang of gratitude for his days working those menial part-time jobs. It had been hard work, but at least he had learned how to pick his battles, unlike these people. Joseph was quick to intervene. He grabbed a teacup and threw it in his son's direction, where it smashed to pieces.
Shut your mouth, Joseph roared. Don't make this any worse than it already is. Dad, I'm just trying to help,
Terry cried.
I said shut it.
Joseph shot him a fierce glare, which finally convinced him to be quiet. Joseph turned back to look up at George. In a much softer voice that contrasted wildly with how he had just shouted, he said,
"As I said before, I humbly apologize, both for my behavior and my son. We had no idea who we were messing with. We will be much more careful in the future. We would like to walk away peacefully now."
Terry was shocked. He had a strong belief in his father's power. He couldn't believe he was watching the man humble himself in front of someone like George. George found his words convincing. The apology seemed sincere. However, he said, "Thank you. I believe you, but I need to hear it from Terry too. I hope you understand." Joseph nodded quickly and beckoned Terry to come to his side.
"Terry, you heard him. It's time to apologize."
Are you kidding me?
Terry sneered in disbelief.
I'm not apologizing to that trash.
Joseph turned his head to give Fritz a questioning look. After a moment, Fritz nodded and lowered his gun, allowing Joseph to stand. He walked over to where his son was still laying on the floor and smacked him across the face.
"Apologize."
They argued the point back and forth several times. Terry made several excuses. The one that he would not admit out loud was that he feared what would happen in the future if he let George win today. Terry felt he would never gain the upper hand on George again. This seemed like the last confrontation to end them all. But his father was relentless and hit him several more times. Finally, Terry realized that there was no other way out. His father stepped back so he could begin his apology to George. George let him talk and repeat himself for a very long time. At first, he watched Terry carefully, trying to measure the sincerity on his face. After a while, he looked down at his hands as if bored. He wanted to see if Terry would assume he could stop apologizing, or if he would continue until George permitted him to stop. Joseph watched all this anxiously, not daring to make a sound or offer additional promises to support his son. He couldn't tell if Terry's apology was working or not. He hoped it would be enough for Fritz and George to allow them to leave the room unharmed. Several minutes later, Terry was still apologizing, even though George had not so much as glanced at him. George decided that was good enough. "All right, thanks. You can go now." Episode 119, Admitting Defeat. Joseph was nearly ready to cry tears of joy when George finally permitted them to leave. He waved at his men, who had hung back by the door all this time, to come over and help Terry stand. As they made their retreat, he thanked George profusely several times. When they were finally gone, Fritz sighed and pocketed his gun. He turned to George and asked, "Is that it? We're just going to let them go?" George nodded. "I don't want to get too notorious too quickly. It's a lot of trouble. I would like a little more time before people start finding out who I am and who my family is. I know Joseph Fuller has been looking into my identity. If you can make sure he doesn't find out anything new, I would appreciate it." Fritz did not completely understand George's motivations, but he knew it was not his place to question them. Instead, he smiled and said, "Yes, Mr. Rudd." Joseph and Terry piled into the car Joseph had brought. The latter is bruised and weary. One of the hired men stayed near them, getting into the car so they could talk. His name was Kyle, and he had quite an impressive reputation in the underworld. He frowned at his employer. "Mr. Fuller, why didn't you let us step in?" Joseph chuckled weakly.
Are you kidding? Didn't you see the gun? We brought knives and clubs. We were completely unequipped for that fight. Not to mention the person holding the gun. Fritz Williams is not someone I want to mess with. Besides, even without accounting for the weapons, the numbers were not on our side.
Kyle scowled. He knew Joseph was right, but it had been frustrating to stand and watch.
How do you want us to deal with this? We can't just let them off.
Joseph gave a cold snort.
What are you talking about? I still have to do business, don't I? We were lucky to be allowed to leave. Lesson learned. They're powerful, and they're not to be messed with. We need to increase security for the rest of my family. I don't believe they'll take further revenge, but I want to be careful. I don't want to see my life's work torn apart over some stupid fight.
But what about... Kyle trailed off, unsure what to say. He had never seen his boss look so fearful or defeated.
All we can do is be patient and keep our heads down,
Joseph said calmly. There was nothing else to say. Everyone in the car sat in silence. Even Terry couldn't argue or fuss, even though he was still furious at everything that had just happened. He just sat there, stunned at his father's words. Joseph turned to look him up and down critically. Then he waved a hand and said,
"We should go to the hospital."
The driver nodded and began heading to the nearest facility. With the situation finally resolved, George said goodbye to Fritz and his associates and left the hotel. After George left, Fritz called Flora to report the situation and what George had done. She listened carefully, nodding her head in satisfaction. After getting the report from Fritz, Flora called George to follow up with him too. She had found more information on the man who had attacked him at the university that day. He had a reputation in the underworld, but he wasn't particularly famous and only seemed to be known for a few tricks. George was surprised and touched that she had looked into it without him having to ask her. "I need to treat you to something. Take you out for a meal and buy you a gift. Thank you so much for your help today," he said gratefully. Flora chuckled lightly. "You're too kind. There's no need to trouble yourself. This is my job." George didn't know what to say. Even if Flora continued to modestly turn down his offers of gifts and extra thanks, he still wanted to express his gratitude somehow. His life had become an absolute whirlwind since coming into his inheritance, and she had patiently guided him through every potential catastrophe. But he knew arguing with her wasn't the way to go. He was just going to have to keep an eye out for an opportunity to express his gratitude some other way in the future. After a quick goodbye, he hung up. But just as he was putting his phone in his pocket, it began to ring again. It was Mary. George frowned. Mary was a friend of Alice, his ex-girlfriend. George couldn't imagine what she would want to talk to him about, but he answered the call anyway. "Mary, how are you?" Mary sobbed in response.
"Where are you? Oh, George, I'm so miserable. Everything's gone wrong. I don't want to live anymore."
George's eyes widened in alarm. "Whoa! Where are you right now? Try to stay calm. Did something happen?" He tried to keep his breathing calm and steady, but Mary's heightened emotions felt practically contagious. He could feel himself getting upset along with her.
"You don't understand,"
Mary wailed.
"Everything's terrible. I can't stay calm. I can't live like this anymore. Don't try to talk me out of it."
That knocked some of the panics out of George's chest. He raised an eyebrow. "Hang on. If you've already made up your mind, then why are you calling me to tell me?" The question seemed to surprise her. Her sobbing slowed for a moment.
"I don't know. I just want to talk to someone, I guess."
George tried not to get too exasperated. She was upset. He just felt he was a strange choice of person for her to call. He was tempted to tell her to go call one of her actual friends, but then it occurred to him that maybe she felt like she couldn't. Maybe she needed help. He also thought, a little darkly, that it would be bad if something did happen to her, and the last phone call logged on her cell phone was a call to him. He sighed. Okay, I'll do my best, all right? Let's talk. What's wrong? What's got you so upset? This brought out fresh sobs from Mary.
Chester doesn't want me anymore.
George frowned. He vaguely recognized the name, but he wasn't sure where he had heard it before. Can you remind me who Chester is?
My boyfriend.
Mary yelled.
He ditched me. He doesn't like me anymore.
George held the phone away from his ear carefully until her voice lowered to a more reasonable volume. Okay, that's tough. I'm sorry. But Chester's not the only guy out there, right? I'm sure you can find someone else, George said hopefully. This doesn't have to be the end of the world. Who needs him? But this made Mary wail loudly again.
You don't understand. I love him.
Episode 120. A Loveless Date.
Chester's the only one I can love.
Mary continued to sob into the phone.
There can't be anybody else. There won't be.
George stood with his phone pressed to his ear, listening as patiently as he could. He wanted to be nice about this, but he also found the whole thing deeply embarrassing. He tried another tactic. What's so great about Chester then? What makes him the only person in the world that could love you?
He's wonderful. He takes me out to the best restaurants. We drive around in his amazing car. He's always buying me new clothes. One time I was sick, and he took me to the doctor himself. He paid for everything. All my friends told me I was so lucky to have him. He's rich, handsome, and considerate. And now he's left me. I'll never find anybody as good as him ever again.
George blinked in disbelief. Everything Mary described sounded to him like the most basic things a guy could do for his girlfriend. And yet, she talked about him as if he was the greatest man on earth.
There's no point.
Mary continued in a hollow voice.
He doesn't want me anymore. I can't live like this. Thanks for listening, I guess. I'm hanging up.
Whoa. Hey, don't hang up yet, George said quickly. Don't do anything rash. I have a small suggestion. Just something you could try if you're willing. Mary sounded curious.
What's your suggestion?
George cleared his throat. This was an act of charity, not a declaration of love. But he was desperate to do something to help Mary calm down and get some perspective. Why don't you let me take you out on a date? I'll show you that Chester isn't that special. Lots of people can do what he did for you. You'll see. But Mary only laughed in response. George frowned. He hadn't meant it as a joke. When she finally stopped laughing, she sounded a little disdainful.
George, are you making fun of me? I know you're trying to make me feel better, but you don't have to try anything desperate. We both know you don't have that much money. You can't provide me with everything Chester was bringing to the table. Do you even understand how much money he was spending on me? I'm sure you're nice enough,
she added in a slightly pitying tone.
But you're not the same as Chester.
George rolled his eyes so hard, he was afraid they were going to fall out of his head. This was his fault for playing everything close to the chest. His classmates still thought his sudden spending spree was the result of winning a bit of money in the lottery. A short-term change. They didn't know he was now actually richer than most of them. Of course Mary was laughing at him. She had no idea who she was talking to. He sighed. Mary, what can I say? At least let me try. Mary was stunned for a moment. She had thought he would back off or apologize, embarrassed, for making grand claims. Instead, he sounded confident.
Okay, she said doubtfully. If you can do what Chester did for me, I'll give you a try. I'll be your girlfriend.
George chuckled at that. Hey, let's not move too fast. We don't have to be officially dating. I'm just going to take you out for a nice time. Mary frowned.
Okay, I guess.
Let's go out tomorrow morning. We'll start at the most high-end restaurant, the Orchid, and have a nice meal there. Then I'll take you to Alexandra Boutique and we'll buy you some nice clothes. After that..." Mary's eyebrows raised higher and higher as George improvised an itinerary for the